I am Christopher Bauer in Mr. Znack's 5th period CWP class, and this is my presentation for comparing and contrasting the death penalty versus life in prison. First, an overview of what the death penalty really is. The death penalty is the ultimate final outcome of the legal world, and because of that, it is often only given to those who either commit high degrees of murder or significant felonies. Because felonies are much less common, this project and presentation will only be covering cases of murder. Death row is the name of the place where those waiting to be executed are held. There are currently over 3,000 people on death row waiting their execution or for an appeal. Since the death penalty was made legal again in 1976, 1,392 people have been executed. During this same period of time, 130 people were released from death row with evidence of their innocence, and another 268 were released with clemencies. Perhaps the biggest misconception when it comes to death row and the death penalty in general is that it is the quick and decisive option for dealing with dangerous criminals, when in reality that's far from the case. Since the death penalty has been made legal, the average time for between sentence and execution has increased all the way to upwards of 178 months, which is roughly 15 years. That means that the average person, from the time they are sentenced, has to be in death row for over 15 years before being executed. At this rate, in the next few years, more prisoners will be dying each year due to natural causes in old age than are actually being executed on death row. Another large issue with the capital punishment system is that it is not entirely fair. Statistics support that there is racial injustice in the current legal system. Out of the 1,392 people executed since 1976, over 50% of them were either African American or Hispanic, as can be seen on this graph. In addition, another issue surrounding the capital punishment is mental disorders. It has been ruled that people with mental disorders can't be executed because they don't have total control of their actions if their brains aren't functioning properly. However, then it goes down into the details of what truly counts as a mental disorder, and that has ended up being the very judgmental determining factor in many cases regarding capital punishment. Lastly, there's the fact that many death row inmates are not even granted top-notch lawyers to defend them. Their studies show that almost all death row inmates cannot afford their own lawyers, which means that they have to be supplied them by authorities, and these lawyers are often nowhere near as qualified as those prosecuting them. Perhaps my biggest issue with capital punishment is the cost side of things. It is a common misconception that the death penalty is much cheaper than life in prison because it is quicker and takes less time to fully ride out. This is far from the case. In nearly all cases, the death penalty is significantly more expensive than life in prison. This is because of all the appeals that take place before a suspect can be executed. In order to avoid killing innocent people, prosecuted suspects are run through many courts and many appeals in order to ensure they are not guilty, and that costs a ton of money. As can be seen here, the average amount of money spent on inmates that go to death row is a ton more than the average cost on those who end up spending the rest of their lives in prison. The cost statistics when you look at individual states becomes even more staggering. For example, in Kansas in 2013, the average cost of a death penalty case was 70% higher than the cases of those regarding life in prison. Also, in Maryland, the death penalty is estimated to cost almost 3 times as much as life in prison, with some cases totaling over $3 million worth of taxpayer money. This is one of my main issues with life in prison versus capital punishment, and why I am personally against capital punishment. In addition, I also believe that the entire concept and effect of the death penalty is not working as it's intended. The death penalty is supposed to deter criminals from committing future crimes and deter people from wanting to commit homicide or anything of the sort, because they are afraid that if they do, they'll be put to death for it. However, as can be seen by this graph, in the United States, states that do not have the death penalty actually have lower homicide rates than those that with the death penalty enacted. So it's almost having the opposite effect on criminals, and the death penalty makes them less afraid to commit such horrible acts. A major question surrounding the death penalty is how to handle those in society convicted of first-degree murder. Well, by definition, first-degree murder is defined as intentional murder that is willful and premeditated with malice aforethought. I believe that even people convicted of first-degree murder should be sentenced to life in prison and not death. Ultimately, it will be much cheaper, which is always a benefit. I feel that it is unnecessary that taxpayer money gets spent threefold just to eliminate these criminals immediately rather than send them to prison. Also, the suspect must be proven entirely guilty without a doubt before they can be executed. This is another major problem that I have with the death penalty. With the death penalty, part of the reason why it takes a full 15 years to process is because they must first prove that without a doubt the suspect is guilty. Well, there have been just over 1,300 executions as a result of capital punishment, and in this same time, 130 people have been released due to proof of their innocence. This means that for every 10 people that get executed, 1 out of 10 is proven innocent. This leaves me to believe that without a doubt, out of those 1,300, at least some probably were innocent and their death was the result of a faulty trial. This is why I believe that the death penalty is not a good option, just because it is the ultimate thing you can take away from someone is their life, and oftentimes there's not 100% certainty that for people that committed a crime. When I talked to my parents about this, they shared a very similar belief set to me. They believe that, for starters, life is the ultimate thing that you can take away from someone, and that's just something that nobody should have the right to do. Killing murderers just because of what they did does not make a right, as it just leads to more killing and more violence. In addition, they agreed on the element of the cost, which is that it's so much cheaper to just imprison criminals for life than it is to sentence them to death, and because of that it seems foolish to sentence them to death when most of them will end up spending 16 years in death row anyway. Lastly, after I showed them the statistics showing the crime rate and how it was actually higher in states that had the death penalty, they agreed with me that it wasn't necessary to have the death penalty at all if it actually appeared to be increasing murder rates across the country. That is the end of my presentation. The sources used for this presentation were deathpenaltyinfo.org, criminalfindlaw.com, CNN, pewresearch.com, Amnesty USA, and The Economist.